deep divers, are you ready to dive into the book of Jonah with us?
Always exciting.
I know what you're thinking.
It's a classic.
The whale story, right?
Right, the Sunday school version.
Exactly. We're going way beyond that today.
We're going deep.
You guys sent in this request to really unpack why this short, almost whimsical book has fascinated people for centuries.
It's a head scratcher.
It is.
In many ways.
And to be honest, I was pretty intrigued too when I first started digging into this.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about Jonah is that everyone thinks they know the story,
Right.
but very few have really grappled with its depth.
Yes.
And we've got some great material to work with here.
Oh, yeah.
You've provided 2 articles on Jonah,
Yeah.
one scholarly, one devotional,
Okay.
and then a thought-provoking sermon transcript to really shake things up.
Yeah. I love having those multiple perspectives.
Absolutely.
It always makes for the best deep dives.
It does.
So to really understand why Jonah's story still matters today, we need to kind of get inside his head a bit.
Yeah.
And this anecdote from the scholarly article about the pastor's wife really got me thinking.
Yes, that story.
Yeah.
It's a great reminder that we all have these preconceived notions, even about biblical figures.
That's true.
We expect prophets to be these untouchable, super holy figures pronouncing doom from mountaintops.
Right.
Jonah throws all that out the window.
He kind of is.
Yeah, he's a mess.
Yeah, one of the articles even called him the prodigal prophet.
Which is kind of an oxymoron, isn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
When you think about it.
When you think about it, yeah.
That's the brilliance of the story. Jonah's actions, or rather his inactions, speak louder than words.
I like that.
Think about it. His whole journey becomes a living parable of Israel's own disobedience.
Okay.
He's told to warn Nineveh.
Right.
And what does he do?
Takes a vacation.
He runs in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
It mirrors how Israel, chosen by God, kept straying from their calling.
And to fully appreciate that parallel, it helps to know a bit about who Jonah was.
Yeah.
Thankfully, one of the articles gave us his resume, so to speak.
Right.
He wasn't some random guy. Jonah was a prophet in the northern kingdom,
Right.
following in the footsteps of giants like Elijah and Elisha.
Talk about pressure.
Yeah.
And remember, he's a contemporary of Hosea and Amos.
Oh, right.
Prophets known for their incredibly direct, often harsh messages.
No holds barred.
These guys weren't afraid to call out injustice.
So Jonah's walking a tough line here.
He is.
And the article, which really digs into the political context, points out that Jonah's message of doom wasn't coming out of nowhere.
It was a tumultuous time.
It lined up with what others were saying about Israel's fate at the hands of the Assyrians.
Which makes his reluctance even more ironic.
Okay, how so?
Here he is warning Israel that all the prosperity they're enjoying under King Jeroboam II is fleeting because of their disobedience.
Right.
Yet Jonah himself seems to think that he's somehow exempt from the consequences of his own disobedience.
It's a classic case of do as I say, not as I do.
Absolutely, right?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And that hypocrisy is what makes him so relatable even thousands of years later.
Sure.
But before we jump ahead to how Jonah's struggles reflect our own, let's stick with the story for a bit longer.
I'm ready.
So we left off with Jonah hightailing it away from God's call to preach to Nineveh.
Quite a dramatic exit.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that first chapter really throws us right into the action, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the guy hops on a ship going in the complete opposite direction.
Bold move.
It is a bold move.
Yeah.
And all chaos breaks loose.
As you might expect.
You would think, right?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting how the story highlights that contrast between Jonah and everyone else on that ship.
Totally.
You've got these seasoned sailors.
Salt of the earth.
Right.
Then you're likely pagans, by the way.
Right, most likely.
Who are utterly terrified by this storm.
Understandably so.
They're praying to their gods, trying to make sense of it all.
And Jonah's below deck sound asleep.
It's almost comical,
It's kind of hilarious.
isn't it?
All 3 sources point this out, the irony of these sailors showing more fear of God than the actual prophet.
Really makes you wonder what's going on in Jonah's head.
It does.
Is he truly fearless
Right.
or just in complete denial?
What do you think?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And it gets even more interesting when you consider how quickly Nineveh repents once Jonah finally delivers the message.
Okay.
It almost seems too easy.
It does.
A whole city changes its ways just from one guy yelling at them for a day.
Right. Like, was it really that simple?
Yeah.
If the Ninevites were so ready to turn to God, was Jonah's reluctance even necessary?
Right.
You know?
Here's where things get really thought-provoking. The scholar who wrote that article brings up a passage from the Gospel of Matthew
Okay.
where Jesus actually uses Nineveh's repentance to make a point.
Wow. Jesus himself referenced this story.
He does.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah.
What'd he say?
Jesus basically says, if those pagans in Nineveh could repent with such sincerity, what's your excuse?
Wow.
He's challenging the religious leaders of his day,
Right.
those who thought they were better than everyone else because of their heritage and their piety.
Okay, so they're using their position almost as a way to be self-righteous.
Absolutely.
That's wrong.
That's a powerful reminder that God's grace knows no bounds.
Oh, okay, so that makes what happens next even more interesting.
Yeah.
Jonah's stuck inside the big fish.
Well, we should probably say great fish, just to be accurate to the text.
Right, of course, the great fish.
Yeah.
So Jonah's in this incredibly tight spot, and he cries out to God in what seems like a heartfelt prayer.
Yeah, it seems like it.
But the devotional guide you shared pointed out something I'd never noticed before.
What's that?
It's all about Jonah.
Yeah.
If you compare his prayer to the Psalms,
Right.
which are filled with praise for God's character and attributes,
Right.
Jonah barely acknowledges who he's even talking to.
He's so focused on himself.
He is. He's so focused on his own misery, it's almost like he's forgotten that he brought this whole thing on himself.
Exactly.
And then there's that vow he makes to offer a sacrifice once he's free.
Oh, yeah.
And the devotional guide interprets that as Jonah simply wanting to get back to the temple and go through the motions of religion.
Just checking off the boxes.
It's not necessarily a heartfelt cry for forgiveness or a true recognition of his own failings.
Which is interesting because he never actually repents, does he?
Never.
Even after everything, he never really acknowledges his disobedience or his prejudice against the Ninevites.
That's a tough one.
It is.
But you know what?
That's that.
It's a struggle I think a lot of us can relate to even today.
Oh, for sure.
How often do we mistake religious actions for true heart change?
It's easy to go through the motions.
It is.
We go to church, we say our prayers, but
Yeah.
are we truly allowing God to transform us from the inside out?
It's incredible, isn't it?
What's that?
How everyone else in the story, the sailors, the Ninevites, seems to get what Jonah doesn't.
Yeah.
They recognize God's power, they respond to his mercy,
Totally.
and Jonah,
Not so much.
not so much.
Yeah.
Let's just say he's not exactly thrilled with how things unfold.
He's having a moment, but it really highlights the central tension of the story, doesn't it?
It does.
You have this stark contrast. The pagan sailors worshiping the God that Jonah's running from the Ninevites, repenting at the drop of a hat.
It's true.
And then there's Jonah stewing in his anger and resentment.
And chapter 4 really lets that anger loose.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost painful to watch his reaction when God spares Nineveh.
It gets intense.
He goes from passive-aggressive to just straight-up rage.
Yeah, that sermon you shared had a hilarious image to describe it.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
Like a cat stalking a very pregnant donkey.
Oh, man.
The cat keeps pushing its luck, getting closer and closer.
Oh, no.
And you just know it's going to get kicked.
That's Jonah.
Pushing his luck and then getting mad when things don't go his way.
And God, in his infinite patience, is trying to reason with him.
It's like God saying, Jonah, seriously?
Yeah.
You're angry about this.
I know.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the heart of Jonah's problem.
Okay, what's that?
It's not just about Nineveh.
It's bigger than that.
It is. It's about grace itself.
Okay.
And this is where I think his story becomes so incredibly relevant to us today.
How so?
Well, let's break down his complaints a little bit because I have a feeling a lot of us have had similar thoughts at some point.
Yeah.
First, he whines that God is too nice, too merciful, too forgiving,
Right.
which is kind of ironic considering he's a prophet who should know God's character.
Yeah, the pastor in that sermon really hit on something important there.
Okay, what's that?
It's tempting to use God's nature as an excuse for our own inaction. Okay, how do we tell ourselves, well, God's all about love and second chances, so I don't actually have to do anything difficult or uncomfortable.
Oh, that's good.
Right.
Oof.
It's this dangerous cocktail of comfort and complacency.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Jonah embodies it perfectly.
He does.
And then there's that whole drama with the plant.
Always, yeah.
God provides this leafy shade for Jonah.
Right.
A worm eats it.
Right.
Jonah's ready to die.
A little dramatic.
It seems a little childish, doesn't it?
It does.
But that's precisely what God uses to expose the real issue at play.
What's that?
Jonah's compassion, if you can even call it that, was entirely self-serving.
Okay.
He cared about the plant because it benefited him. There was no genuine empathy for the plant itself or for the creatures around him.
It's a harsh lesson, but one we all need to hear.
It is.
Our compassion can be so easily tainted by self-interest.
So what makes Jonah's story so relatable, even uncomfortable for us today?
That's the question.
It boils down to this. Jonah's real struggle wasn't just selfishness. It was rejecting grace itself, both for himself and for others.
And all the sources we've discussed point to this truth.
Okay.
Grace, by its very definition, is undeserved.
Right.
You can't earn it, you can't bargain for
It's
it.
free.
And that's a tough pill to swallow for someone like Jonah, who wants to believe he's somehow better than the Ninevites.
He's clinging to this idea that God's favor is based on merit, on being worthy.
But that completely contradicts the very nature of grace.
It does.
And the scholar who wrote that article connected Jonah's attitude to some passages in Deuteronomy about God choosing Israel.
All right.
It's easy to take those passages and twist them into a sense of superiority,
Right.
of deserving God's love more than others.
But true faith, as we see with the Ninevites, requires humility, a recognition that we are all in need of grace.
Well said.
And that brings us to the pastor's powerful question. Are we like Jonah, wanting to withhold grace from those we deem unworthy?
He used the example of people with AIDS,
Yeah.
but it could apply to anyone we consider other, less than, or deserving of judgment.
That's so good.
It's a challenging question that forces us to confront our own prejudices and ask ourselves where we might be holding back compassion.
And what's so powerful about the sermon is the conclusion the pastor draws.
Okay.
He reminds us that God's answer to Jonah and to us is always the same: more grace.
Go on.
And that grace is most fully embodied in Jesus.
Jesus is grace personified.
He extended love and forgiveness to the outcast, the marginalized, those deemed unworthy by society.
And he calls us to do the same.
Which makes the ending of Jonah even more poignant, don't you think?
What's that?
He never explicitly repents. There's no neat resolution.
There's no tying it all up with a bow.
No.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the story is left open-ended on purpose.
I think you're right.
You think so?
The lack of resolution forces us, the readers, to wrestle with the questions the story raises.
It does.
It challenges us to examine our own hearts and ask, where do grace and prejudice collide in our own lives? Are we willing to let go of our need to be right, to be superior, to be in control, and embrace the radical countercultural way of grace?
Those are powerful questions. We'll leave you to ponder today, deep divers.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the depths of Jonah.
My pleasure.
It's a story that continues to resonate, challenge, and inspire even thousands of years after it was written.
Absolutely.